The rope grooves in the courthouse oak were still fresh on the morning of November 9th, 1867, when Selma woke to find 7 bodies suspended from the hanging tree. Not the bodies anyone expected. These men wore white hoods pulled down around their necks like nooses made of cotton, their faces purple in the dawn light, their fine leather boots swaying 3 feet above ground that still held their own boot prints from the night before. The courthouse doors stood open, both leaves torn from their hinges. Inside, the basement entrance gaped like a mouth, and the smell rising from below made even the sheriff turn away. 12 men had entered that basement the previous evening. 7 hung from the oak. The other 5 were never found. The only witness was a carpenter named Gideon Ward, who sat on the courthouse steps at sunrise, hands clean, eyes forward, waiting for questions no white man in Dallas County would dare to ask. Gideon Ward earned his living building coffins, which gave him a peculiar authority in Selma. People noticed quality when it came to burying their dead. The joints on his caskets never separated, even in Alabama clay. The lids sat flush. The brass handles he imported from Mobile never tarnished, and the satin lining he stitched himself held smooth against a corpse's shoulders, for however long grief required an open viewing. He worked alone in a shop behind the Methodist Church on Broad Street, a single-room structure he'd built himself after mustering out of the Union Army in the spring of 1865. The smell of pine shavings mixed with the linseed oil he used to seal the wood, and on warm days, the scent carried through the neighborhood, sweet and final. He was 31 years old that autumn, tall enough that he had to duck through most doorways, lean in the way of men who'd spent years moving fast with little food. His hands were mapped with scars from carpentry tools and older wounds that puckered white against his dark skin. He spoke rarely. When he did speak, his voice carried the low certainty of someone who'd learned that words were tools requiring the same precision as dovetail joints. People said he'd been a scout during the war, though Gideon himself never confirmed or denied the stories. What was documented? His enlistment papers with the 3rd Regiment United States Colored Troops, dated February 1863. His discharge certificate signed by a colonel whose name still carried weight in certain northern circles. A commendation letter mentioning reconnaissance work near Vicksburg that resulted in the capture of a Confederate supply depot. Beyond that, silence. He lived in a room above his workshop, accessed by an exterior staircase he'd engineered to creak on the 4th step, giving him warning if anyone approached while he slept. The room held a cot, a table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a locked trunk containing items he never showed anyone. A Colt Army revolver he'd carried through Mississippi and Tennessee, a Bowie knife with a 9-inch blade, a compass, 3 maps of Dallas County rendered in his own hand, and a leather journal filled with names and addresses written in a cipher he'd learned from a Pinkerton man in Nashville. September brought the first whispers. A field hand named Moses, who occasionally bought Gideon's scrap lumber for his cabin repairs, mentioned that white men were meeting in unusual places. Not the usual gatherings at the Masonic Hall or the Agricultural Society's rooms above the bank. These were night meetings, lanterns shuttered, horses tied where the road bent away from town. Moses had seen 7 horses outside the old Pritchard barn on 3 separate Thursdays. Another man, a blacksmith's apprentice, reported similar gatherings near the covered bridge on the Cahaba Road. The pattern was clear to anyone who'd learned to read Confederate troop movements. These were rotating locations, deliberately scattered, designed to avoid establishing a predictable target. Gideon listened without comment, planing a board for a child's coffin while Moses talked. When the field hand finished, Gideon asked one question. "Who's organizing it?" Moses didn't know, but he'd heard a name mentioned twice. Edmund Yancey, a cotton factor who'd served as a Confederate major and now controlled the weighing and sale of most crops in Dallas County. A man who could make or break a farmer's year with a stroke of his pen, determining whether cotton graded middling or good ordinary, whether accounts would be settled in cash or carried forward at interest that compounded faster than most men could calculate. The upcoming election was scheduled for November 12th. New constitutional amendments promised voting rights for black men. Alabama's white establishment, still reeling from military defeat and federal occupation, faced the prospect of former slaves determining who would sit in the state house, who would collect taxes, who would enforce laws. The Klan had emerged to prevent exactly that. Not through debate or political organization, but through systematic terror designed to make voting more dangerous than remaining silent. The first coffin request came on October 2nd. A widow named Sarah Hawkins, whose husband had been found in a ditch on the Cahaba Road with his neck broken. The official story: he'd been drinking and fell from his horse. The reality: whispered in the quarters but never spoken to white authorities. Thomas Hawkins had been overheard saying he intended to vote in November. He'd been 34 years old, a freedman who'd purchased 5 acres and was teaching his children to read using a primer he'd bought in Montgomery. His neck showed bruising consistent with a rope, not a fall, and his horse had been found grazing peacefully 200 yards from where his body lay, suggesting the animal hadn't thrown him. Gideon built the coffin without comment, took payment in chickens and preserved vegetables, and attended the funeral at the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Sunday. He listened to the sermon about justice deferred and noted who attended and who stayed away. He noticed that the white sheriff didn't come, nor did any of the town's white leadership, despite Thomas Hawkins having owed money to half the merchants on Broad Street. Their absence was a message. This death would not be investigated, and anyone asking questions would find themselves similarly isolated. The second coffin came 2 weeks later. A field hand named Jacob shot while walking home after dark. The bullet had entered his back between the shoulder blades, suggesting he'd been running when he died. His widow couldn't pay, so Gideon built the coffin anyway, a simple pine box that he delivered himself to the church. At the burial, he counted 23 people, all black, all careful to leave before sunset. Fear was changing movement patterns. People who'd once lingered after church or gathered in the evening to share food and stories now hurried home before dark, calculating routes that avoided isolated stretches of road, organizing children to travel in groups. The social fabric was being rewound to accommodate terror. Gideon had seen this before, in Tennessee near Chattanooga, where Confederate sympathizers had hunted Union scouts using the same tactics. Make the night dangerous enough, and you controlled daylight behavior. Make examples of the visible, and you drove the rest underground. He'd survived those months by learning to move differently, to think like the men hunting him, to recognize patterns in their patrol schedules, and anticipate their next moves. The same skills applied now. He began mapping the meetings more systematically. On his evening walks, ostensibly checking lumber deliveries at the rail depot or visiting the cemetery to take measurements for a plot marker, he noted which roads showed fresh hoof prints, which buildings had been entered recently based on disturbed dust or displaced cobwebs, which merchants closed early on meeting nights. He cross-referenced this information with the names Moses and others mentioned, building a network diagram that showed not just who attended these gatherings, but who provided horses, who owned the properties, who stood watch while others met inside. The pattern centered on Edmund Yancey. The cotton factor's ledger controlled the economic life of every farmer in Dallas County, and his political connections extended to Montgomery and beyond. Gideon learned that Yancey had served on the board of the Selma Agricultural Society before the war, a gentleman's organization that had lobbied for secession, that he'd been wounded at Shiloh and returned home a major, that he'd reorganized the county's cotton markets after Appomattox, positioning himself as the essential middleman between farmers desperate to sell and buyers in Mobile and New Orleans who could dictate terms. He was 47 years old, owned a substantial house on Water Street, and had 3 sons who'd survived the war and now worked in his firm. The third coffin came on October 26th. A woman named Rachel, beaten to death outside her cabin while her children hid in the root cellar. The pretext: she'd spoken disrespectfully to a white woman in town. The reality: her husband planned to vote. And this was a message about what happened to families who participated in politics. Gideon built a larger coffin this time, working through the night. And when he delivered it at dawn, he found Rachel's husband, Daniel, sitting on the cabin steps with a shotgun across his knees. The man's eyes were hollow with grief and rage, and Gideon recognized the look. He'd worn it himself once. "They want us to fight back," Gideon said quietly, sitting beside Daniel without asking permission. "They want an excuse to bring in militia, declare martial law, suspend the election. They want you to give them justification for what they're already planning." Daniel said nothing for a long time. Then, "So we do nothing? We just let them kill us?" "I didn't say that." The 2 men sat in silence while the sun rose. Eventually Daniel spoke again, his voice breaking. "I can't vote knowing it'll get my children killed. But I can't not vote knowing that's what they want. What am I supposed to do?" Gideon had no answer that would ease the impossible mathematics of survival and dignity. So he asked a different question. If someone stopped them from making that choice necessary, would you stand with him? Daniel turned, studying Gideon's face. "What are you asking?" "Just gathering information." But both men understood what had been offered and accepted. Selma in October 1867 was a town built on deliberate blindness. 23,000 people lived in Dallas County, nearly 3/4 of them black, most of them formerly enslaved. The white minority controlled every institution: the courthouse, the banks, the cotton warehouses, the newspapers, the sheriff's office, the militia armory. Federal troops occupied the city. A small garrison of the 43rd Infantry quartered at the old Confederate barracks, but their commander had orders to maintain order, not to enforce social revolution. The distinction was meaningful. When complaints arrived about night riders and mysterious deaths, the federal captain filed reports and did nothing, constrained by the same political calculations that kept his superiors in Washington cautious about alienating the white South. The Selma newspaper, the Dallas Herald, reported each death with careful, passive construction. Thomas Hawkins was found deceased. Jacob Williams died from a gunshot wound of unknown origin. Rachel Turner succumbed to injuries sustained in a regrettable incident. The journalism was technically accurate and fundamentally dishonest, reporting facts while obscuring causation. No editorials demanded investigation. No one asked who benefited from these deaths or why they clustered in the weeks before the election. The silence was editorial policy, enforced by a publisher who understood that truth-telling would cost him printing contracts and advertising revenue. The churches divided along predictable lines. White congregations preached resignation and obedience, citing scripture about earthly masters and heavenly rewards. Black congregations preached endurance and dignity, carefully avoiding explicit calls for political action while everyone understood the subtext. The Methodist minister, a white man from Charleston who'd been appointed to his position before the war, delivered a sermon on October 21st about the dangers of rushing social change. The African Methodist Episcopal minister, a formerly enslaved man who'd learned to read in secret and now led a congregation of 300, preached that same day about Moses leading his people to freedom. Both men knew they were speaking in code. Only one would face consequences for it. Gideon attended both services that Sunday, sitting in the segregated balcony of the white church for the early service, then walking 3 blocks to the black church for the late morning gathering. He noted who attended each, who spoke to whom afterward, which white faces appeared at the black church to observe and report back. The surveillance was constant and mutual. White Selma watched Black Selma for signs of organization or resistance. Black Selma watched White Selma for patterns that might predict the next attack. The courthouse stood at the center of town, a 3-story brick structure built in the 1850s with columns across the front and a cupola on top. The basement had been used for storage during the war, holding Confederate records and supplies. Now it sat largely empty, a warren of rooms with brick walls and poor ventilation, accessible through a side entrance on Water Street that faced away from the main square. Gideon had been inside once, delivering a bench he'd built for the circuit judge's chambers. He'd noted the layout, the narrow stairs, the low ceilings, the small windows set high in the walls, the heavy oak doors that could be barred from inside. A good place to meet if you wanted privacy and security. A terrible place to be if someone sealed the exits. On October 30th, Moses brought news that the next meeting would be the last before the election. Final plans, final instructions, final distribution of assignments. Gideon asked where. Moses didn't know, but he'd heard Edmund Yancey mention the old courthouse. Something about it being fitting that they'd use the seat of the county's legitimate power to plan the preservation of that power. The poetry of it appealed to men who saw themselves as defenders of civilization rather than terrorists enforcing racial hierarchy. Gideon spent the next week preparing. He visited the courthouse 3 times during business hours, ostensibly to discuss a furniture commission with the clerk of courts, but actually mapping the basement's layout in his mind. He studied the ventilation system, such as it was. 3 brick shafts rising to the roof, each covered with iron grates that could be removed from above. He examined the exits, the main door at the base of the stairs, plus 2 smaller doors leading to exterior stairwells that emerged on opposite sides of the building. Both smaller doors had deadbolt locks that could be secured from the outside with padlocks. He purchased rope from 3 different suppliers, buying small amounts from each to avoid suspicion. He bought candles and lamp oil, explaining that his workshop needed better lighting for winter evenings. He cleaned and loaded his revolver, checking the action on all 6 chambers, replacing worn springs with parts he'd saved from the war. He sharpened his knife on a whetstone until the edge would shave hair from his forearm. And he wrote a letter, sealed it in an envelope, and left it with Daniel, Rachel's widower, with instructions to deliver it to the federal garrison commander if Gideon didn't return by dawn on November 9th. The letter contained a complete record of everything Gideon had observed: names, dates, locations, methods, patterns. It documented 3 months of systematic terrorism, naming Edmund Yancey and 11 other men as the core organizers of the Dallas County Klan. It provided enough detail that even a reluctant federal officer would have to investigate. Gideon didn't expect justice from that letter. The war had taught him not to trust institutions to do what individuals could accomplish themselves. But he believed in creating insurance, in making his death expensive enough that it might deter the next campaign of terror. He didn't intend to die, though. He'd survived worse odds in Tennessee, and those men had been professional soldiers. These were planters and merchants playing at guerrilla warfare, men accustomed to power but not to personal risk. They'd learned to terrorize people who couldn't fight back, but they'd never faced someone who understood their methods, because he'd used those same methods himself. The war had taught Gideon how to scout enemy positions, how to move through hostile territory, how to infiltrate camps and gather intelligence. It had also taught him how to kill efficiently when necessary, and how to make those deaths serve strategic purposes rather than emotional ones. November 8th arrived cold and clear. Gideon opened his shop at dawn as usual, worked on a sideboard commission until noon, then locked up and walked to the rail depot. He carried a canvas bag containing rope, candles, his revolver, his knife, a set of carpenter's tools, and a change of clothes. To anyone watching, he looked like a tradesman heading out of town for a delivery job, a common enough sight that it attracted no attention. He boarded a freight car heading east, rode 3 miles, then jumped off when the train slowed for Chakchu grade. He doubled back cross-country, approaching Selma from the south, moving through pine forests and skirting cotton fields until he reached the edge of town as dusk settled over the river. The courthouse basement would be his killing floor. But first, it had to become a trap. The courthouse stood empty at 7 o'clock on the evening of November 8th, its windows dark, its doors locked for the night. Selma's legitimate business had concluded hours earlier. Court cases adjourned, deeds recorded, taxes collected. The machinery of governance shuttered until morning. But the building's unofficial business was just beginning. Gideon watched from the shadows behind the slave market, an abandoned platform where human beings had been sold until 3 years earlier, as the first horsemen arrived. They came in pairs and trios, riding from different directions, dismounting at the hitching posts on Water Street. Each man wore ordinary clothes, work coats, sturdy boots, hats pulled low. No hoods yet. Those would come later, inside, where the ritual transformation from merchant and planter into anonymous enforcer could proceed with theatrical gravity. Gideon counted them as they arrived: Edmund Yancey and his 2 oldest sons, the bank president, a sharp-faced man named Calloway, 3 cotton brokers who worked the warehouses on the river, 2 lawyers who'd served in the Confederate Army, a Baptist minister whose church stood on Dallas Avenue, a physician who'd sutured wounds on both sides during the war and now treated black patients only when paid in advance. And finally, a figure Gideon hadn't expected but recognized immediately: Captain Thornton, the federal garrison commander. 12 men total. 13 if you counted the lookout posted near the courthouse entrance. A young man barely 20 who smoked nervously while keeping watch on the empty square. Gideon waited until all 12 had descended into the basement before moving. The lookout was distracted, focused on the road where late riders might appear, not on the courthouse itself. Gideon approached from behind, using the building as cover, moving with the careful silence he'd learned hunting Confederate patrols. He carried a coil of rope over one shoulder, a canvas sack in his left hand, his knife in his belt. The revolver he'd left behind. Guns made noise, and noise attracted attention. Tonight required different tools. The first objective was the ventilation system. 3 brick shafts rose from the basement, each terminating in an iron grate bolted to the roof. Gideon had already removed those bolts during his reconnaissance visits, replacing them with dummy bolts that looked secure but pulled free with minimal pressure. Now he climbed to the roof using a drainage pipe on the building's north side, gaining purchase on brick windowsills, hauling himself over the cornice onto the flat expanse where rainwater pooled around the cupola. The night was moonless, clouds obscuring what little starlight might have illuminated his work. He worked on the ventilation shafts for 20 minutes, removing each iron grate and replacing it with canvas sacks stuffed with rags soaked in lamp oil. Not enough to kill, he needed them alive for what came next, but enough to make the air close and heavy, to create discomfort that would shorten tempers and dull reflexes. The smell would be barely noticeable at first, mixing with the candle smoke and the sweat of 12 men packed into a low-ceilinged space. By the time they recognized the danger, their options would have narrowed to nothing. The second objective was the exits. The main door, where they'd entered, opened outward into the stairwell. Gideon couldn't bolt it from outside without being seen, but he could make it difficult. He descended from the roof, circled to the Water Street entrance, and found the lookout still focused on the square. Moving along the building's foundation, Gideon reached the basement's main door and wedged iron spikes into the gap between door and frame at 3 points: top, middle, bottom. Not a seal, just resistance. If someone tried to push from inside, the door would seem stuck, requiring several men to force it. The confusion would buy him precious seconds. The 2 side exits were easier. Both had exterior padlocks, supposedly to prevent vagrants from sheltering in the basement. The courthouse clerk kept keys, but Gideon had brought his own locks, identical models purchased from the same Birmingham foundry. He swapped them quickly, pocketing the original locks, securing the basement with hardware only he could open. The lookout never turned around. Now came the dangerous part: getting inside. Gideon had considered and rejected a dozen approaches. The obvious method, forcing entry through one of the exits he'd just sealed, would alert everyone inside and turn the operation into a straight fight against 12 armed men. The alternative, waiting for them to emerge, would give them the advantage of movement and dispersion. What he needed was surprise, position, and the leverage that came from controlling a confined space. He needed them panicked, disoriented, making mistakes. The solution lay in the courthouse's architecture. The main floor stood 12 feet above the basement, separated by thick timbers supporting floorboards that carried the weight of furniture, people, and the daily business of governance. But those timbers weren't solid. The builders had used a lattice structure to save on lumber costs, creating voids that allowed pipes and utility access. And in one corner of the main courtroom, beneath the judge's bench, a trap door provided access to those voids for maintenance work. Gideon had noticed it during his reconnaissance, a 2-foot square panel secured with a simple latch. He entered the courthouse through a second-floor window he'd previously compromised, its latch filed down so it appeared locked, but open to pressure. Inside, the building smelled of dust and floor wax and old paper. He moved through darkened corridors, testing each footfall before committing his weight, avoiding the boards he'd marked mentally as creaky. The courtroom door stood open, and moonlight filtering through high windows provided enough illumination to navigate. He crossed to the judge's bench, lifted the trap door, and lowered himself into the crawl space. The space was cramped, maybe 18 inches of clearance, filled with spider webs and mouse droppings and the detritus of 40 years of construction, but it ran the length of the courtroom directly above the basement meeting room, and the floorboards below had gaps where they'd shrunk with age, gaps that transmitted sound perfectly. Gideon lay on his stomach in the filth and listened to the meeting taking place 8 feet beneath him. Edmund Yancey's voice carried authority shaped by decades of command. Gentlemen, we gather tonight to finalize arrangements that will determine whether civilization persists in Dallas County or whether we descend into chaos. The federal government has imposed upon us a constitutional amendment that grants suffrage to individuals wholly unprepared for such responsibility. We cannot prevent this abomination through legal channels. We must therefore ensure that those who might vote understand the consequences of exercising that right. A murmur of agreement rippled through the basement. Gideon recognized voices. Calloway the banker, using words like fiscal responsibility and property requirements. The Baptist minister invoking scripture about masters and servants. The doctor discussing racial temperament and mental capacity, wrapping prejudice in medical language that sounded objective while serving the same function as a noose. The election occurs in 4 days, Yancey continued. We have identified 27 individuals who have expressed intent to vote. 3 are already dealt with. The remaining 24 must receive clear messages before November 12th. Through the gaps in the floorboards, Gideon could see occasional movement, a shadow passing beneath a lantern, the flicker of candlelight reflecting off whitewashed walls. He counted the voices to confirm his tally. 12 men, just as he'd observed arriving. 12 men planning 24 murders with the same casual efficiency they'd bring to calculating cotton weights or drafting contracts. One of Yancey's sons spoke up. Some of them are hiding. The field hand named Daniel hasn't been seen since his wife died. We've checked his cabin twice. Then burn the cabin, Yancey said flatly. Smoke him out. If he dies in the fire, so be it. What matters is that others see the consequences of defiance. The Baptist minister raised a concern. The federal garrison, Captain Thornton, has assured us of his cooperation, but if the violence becomes too visible, he may be compelled to intervene for appearances. The captain understands the realities of governance, Yancey replied. He knows that peace requires certain adjustments. Don't you, Captain? Captain Thornton's voice carried a different tone than the others, less certain, more defensive. I'm not here to endorse violence. I'm here to ensure that our legitimate concerns about social order are heard. If certain individuals choose not to vote because they fear for their safety, well, that's a matter of personal choice, not military jurisdiction. The rationalization hung in the stale air. A federal officer charged with protecting rights was instead enabling their suppression, telling himself he was maintaining peace when he was actually choosing whose suffering to ignore. Gideon thought about the letter he'd left with Daniel, the detailed accusations that named Thornton as complicit. If things went wrong tonight, at least that record would survive. Let's review the list, Yancey said, and papers rustled below. We've divided the county into 4 districts, each assigned to 3 men. District 1, northwest of town, includes the carpenter, Gideon Ward. He's been asking too many questions, attending too many funerals. He'll be first. Hearing his own name spoken by men planning his death created a curious dissonance. Gideon remained perfectly still, breathing slowly, listening as Yancey detailed the plan. 3 men would visit his workshop after midnight, when he'd likely be asleep. They'd bar the door, douse the building with kerosene, and set it alight. If he tried to escape, they'd shoot him. If he burned, they'd call it a tragic accident involving lamp oil and wood shavings. Either way, the message would be clear. District 2 covers the river settlements, Yancey continued, naming 6 more targets. Farmers, field hands, a mill worker, a minister's son. Each name came with an address, a description, a suggested method. Rope for some, bullets for others, blunt force for those who needed to look like they'd fallen or been kicked by livestock. The planning was meticulous, demonstrating experience and organization. These men had done this before, elsewhere, refining their techniques through repetition. The meeting continued for 90 minutes. They discussed tactics, timing, coordination. They debated whether to act on November 9th or wait until the 11th, the night before the election. The consensus: start early, create momentum, let fear multiply itself. They assigned roles. Who would participate directly? Who would provide alibis? Who would ensure the sheriff filed reports that obscured rather than illuminated? They even discussed contingencies if federal troops intervened, though Thornton assured them that wouldn't happen. One final matter, Yancey said as the meeting wound down. We take an oath tonight. Each man here swears on his honor and his life to protect our brothers and maintain silence about our work. The penalty for breaking that oath is death, swift and certain. Are we agreed? A chorus of affirmations echoed through the basement. Then Yancey led them through a ritual Gideon couldn't fully see but could hear. Invocations of blood and soil and heritage, promises to defend civilization against the barbarian tide, oaths sworn on Bibles and swords and symbols of a lost confederacy that refused to die. It would have been ridiculous if it weren't so deadly. Grown men playing at secret societies while planning to burn families alive. When the ritual concluded, Yancey spoke one last time. We dispersed separately as we arrived. No one speaks of tonight. We reconvene on November 10th to begin operations. God preserve our cause and our people. Chairs scraped as men stood. Gideon heard footsteps moving toward the door, voices bidding farewell. He'd been lying motionless for nearly 2 hours, and now he had perhaps 3 minutes before they discovered the exits wouldn't open. He didn't waste them. The first indication something was wrong came when the main door refused to budge. From his position in the crawl space, Gideon heard the initial confusion. A grunt of effort, a muttered curse, then Yancey's voice demanding to know who'd sealed them in. Men crowded the stairwell, multiple shoulders pushing against the door, discovering the iron spikes that turned their exit into a barricade. Panic hadn't set in yet. That would take another minute. But uncertainty rippled through voices that moments earlier had been confident and commanding. The side doors, someone said, and footsteps scattered across the basement. Gideon tracked the movement by sound. 3 or 4 men heading east, others going west, all converging on exits they expected to provide escape. The iron rattle of locked doors, followed by harder impacts as shoulders hit wood, then voices overlapping in accusation and confusion. Who locked these? Why won't they open? This is deliberate. Yancey's command voice cut through the chaos. Everyone stop. Think. This building was empty when we arrived. Someone sealed us in since we entered. That means they're still here, probably above us. Silence descended, the kind that precedes violence, as 12 men tried to process the tactical situation. They were armed, Gideon had assumed that, but their weapons were holstered or pocketed, intended for intimidation or murder under controlled circumstances, not for combat in a confined space. Their lanterns provided light, but that same light illuminated them while leaving the edges of the basement in shadow. They were trapped, and they knew it, and the knowing made them dangerous. Spread out, Yancey ordered. Away from the doors. Cover all approaches. Whoever's doing this has to reveal themselves eventually. That was Gideon's cue. He'd already moved from his listening position, to directly above the main meeting room, positioning himself over a section of floor where a previous leak had weakened the boards. Now he drew his knife, inserted it between two planks, and pried with controlled force. The wood resisted, then cracked with a sound like a branch breaking. He widened the gap with his hands, peeling back a section of flooring large enough to drop through. Below, 12 faces turned upward as dust and debris rained down. In the quarter second before anyone reacted, Gideon glimpsed the whole tableau. Men frozen in place, mouths opening to shout, hands reaching for weapons they hadn't yet drawn. He dropped through the gap, landing in a crouch between the main table and the east wall, the Bowie knife already moving. The nearest man was one of Yancey's sons, young and quick, but surprised. Gideon's blade found the gap between collarbone and neck, severing the subclavian artery in a strike he'd practiced in Tennessee until it became muscle memory. The young man collapsed without sound, blood pressure dropping too fast for his brain to process what had happened. Gideon was already moving, using the falling body as cover, pivoting toward the second son, who'd begun to draw a pistol. The basement erupted. Someone fired a shot that went wide, the muzzle flash illuminating faces twisted with shock and rage. Gideon kicked over the main table, creating a barrier, then extinguished the nearest lantern with a backhand strike that plunged half the room into darkness. Men shouted over each other, trying to coordinate, but the space worked against them. Low ceilings prevented effective movement. Support pillars created blind corners. The very security they'd sought, walls too thick for sound to escape, now imprisoned them with their executioner. Gideon had spent the previous week visualizing this moment, planning movements like chess combinations, anticipating how panic would fragment group cohesion. He moved in the darkness he'd created, letting his targets silhouette themselves against the remaining lanterns. The second son died reaching for his fallen brother, knife entering below the ribs and angling upward to find the heart. A cotton broker fired blindly, hitting the Baptist minister instead, the bullet passing through the minister's shoulder and lodging in the brick wall. The broker died next, Gideon's blade opening his throat before he could chamber another round. "Shoot the lanterns!" Yancey roared, demonstrating the tactical thinking that had made him an officer. "Deny him the darkness!" But destroying their own light meant shooting in a room where 12 men stood crowded together, where every bullet risked hitting an ally. The banker, Calloway, fired at a shadow that turned out to be a support pillar. The lawyer nearest him, nerves shattered, shot Calloway in the back, then screamed that he'd been tricked into murder. Gideon let them kill each other for 15 seconds, using the chaos to circle behind the group, positioning himself near the stairs. A lantern crashed, spilling burning oil across the floor. The flame spread along floorboards coated with decades of grime and leaked kerosene from lamps past. New light bloomed, illuminating the carnage. 4 bodies down, blood pooling in depressions in the uneven floor. The remaining men backing toward the sealed exits with weapons raised. 8 survivors. Gideon counted them in the flickering light, matching faces to names from the meeting. Yancey, Thornton, the doctor, the second lawyer, 3 cotton brokers. "Your ward," Yancey said, recognition cutting through his shock. "The carpenter. You've killed half my men. Why? What do you want?" Gideon stepped into the firelight, knife bloody, clothes spattered with arterial spray, face expressionless. "I want you to understand something. You planned to burn me tonight, to kill 24 people before the election, to terrorize an entire county into silence. Now I'm giving you a choice." "What choice?" The doctor demanded, his voice breaking. Confess. Tell me who in this room provides money, who provides intelligence, who signs the orders from Montgomery. Tell me which officials know and look away. Tell me every name, every connection, every crime. Or die here without anyone knowing what happened. You're one man with a knife, one of the cotton brokers said, trying to sound brave and failing. We're 8 with guns. You'll die before you reach half of us. Gideon smiled, and something in that expression made the broker step backward. I survived 3 years behind Confederate lines. I've killed more men than you've cheated on your weighing scales, and you're trapped in a room I designed as a killing box. So let me make this simpler. The first man to talk goes free. The rest die. The lawyer broke first, proving that education didn't produce courage under pressure. His name was Marcus Finch, a man of 35 who'd prosecuted desertion cases for the Confederacy and now handled property disputes for planters cheating former slaves out of wages. He pointed at Yancey with a shaking hand and said, "He's the organizer. He gets orders from Senator Dougherty in Montgomery. They've been planning this since the amendment passed." "Shut your mouth," Yancey hissed, but the dam had broken. Finch talked faster, words tumbling over themselves as if speaking quickly enough might purchase safety. He named the judge who dismissed assault complaints against Klan members, the sheriff who destroyed evidence, the Montgomery legislators who'd passed resolutions praising local defense organizations while officially condemning violence, the Birmingham investors who'd financed weapons purchases. Each revelation peeled back another layer of the machinery that sustained terror across Alabama, showing how individual brutality connected to institutional complicity. The cotton factors coordinate between counties, Finch continued, nearly hyperventilating. Yancey meets with his counterparts in Montgomery, Tuscaloosa, Huntsville. They share methods, targets, tactics. There's a network, a whole structure. The doctor shot Finch. Point-blank range, the bullet entering below the lawyer's left eye and exiting, through the back of his skull, spraying bone fragments across the whitewashed wall. The doctor turned his pistol toward Gideon and said, "He was lying, making up stories to save himself. We're patriots, not criminals." Gideon had been expecting something like this. Men facing death often chose to kill witnesses rather than accept exposure. He'd already moved when the doctor fired, dropping low and left, closing the distance before the doctor could adjust his aim. The knife found the doctor's wrist, severing tendons, causing fingers to spasm open and drop the pistol. Gideon caught the falling weapon and shot the doctor in the chest, using the man's own gun, then pivoted and shot one of the cotton brokers who'd been raising his own pistol. 6 left. The fire was spreading. The initial blaze from the broken lantern had ignited the spilled oil-soaked rags Gideon had stuffed in the ventilation shafts, and now smoke was pouring into the basement, thick and black and choking. The air grew hot. Men coughed, eyes watering, gasping for oxygen that was rapidly being consumed. The psychological pressure multiplied. They were trapped, under attack, and now burning. The compartmentalization that let planters plan murders over drinks was disintegrating under the immediate reality of their own mortality. Captain Thornton tried a different approach. "Ward, if that's your name, I'm a federal officer. These men may have committed crimes, but you're compounding them with murder. Surrender now, and I'll ensure you receive a trial. You have my word." Gideon laughed, the sound carrying no humor. "Your word. You sat in this basement and approved plans to burn families alive. You're not here wearing a uniform, Captain. You're here in civilian clothes, making deals with terrorists. You forfeited your authority when you chose to become one of them. I never approved. You attended 4 previous meetings: September 12th, September 26th, October 10th, October 24th. Each time you provided intelligence about federal troop movements and garrison priorities. You told Yancey which nights his men could operate without military interference. You're not a neutral observer, Captain. You're an accomplice. Thornton's face went slack as he realized Gideon possessed detailed documentation. The implications terrified him more than the immediate danger. If Gideon had recorded that information, copies might exist elsewhere. Insurance against exactly this situation. Thornton's career, his reputation, his life after tonight, all of it depended on Gideon dying without talking. But the mathematics had shifted. Killing Gideon might eliminate one witness, but it wouldn't eliminate the records. "What do you want?" Thornton asked, the question carrying different weight now. "I want you to write everything down, every meeting, every agreement, every order you facilitated, names, dates, details. I want you to create a document so complete that even politicians in Washington can't ignore it." "And then what? You let us go?" "No. Then I decide whether you hang here or hang later." Yancey interrupted, his voice still carrying command despite everything. "Ward's bluffing. He can't let any of us live. We'd testify against him, and he'd hang for murder. He's trying to extract information before killing us anyway. Don't give him anything." It was a good tactical point, demonstrating why Yancey had risen to leadership. He was right that Gideon's promises were strategically worthless. Releasing witnesses guaranteed his own execution. But Yancey had made a mistake in articulating that logic, because it clarified the survivors' own mathematics. Confessing gained them nothing if they were dead either way. Silence became rational again. Gideon needed to fracture that calculus. He walked to the remaining cotton broker, a heavy-set man of 50 named Pritchard, who'd been silent throughout the violence, and put the pistol to his head. "Tell me about the property seizures, the foreclosures on black farmers who couldn't pay debts after your brothers burned their crops. How many families?" Pritchard wet himself, the stain spreading across his trousers, but he spoke. 17 since July. Yancey's firm holds the mortgages. When they can't pay, we foreclose and sell to white buyers at discount. It's business, not..." Yancey shot Pritchard himself this time, eliminating another witness. The body slumped, and Yancey turned his pistol toward Gideon. "You want confessions? Come take them." 5 left. Yancey, Thornton, 2 cotton brokers, 1 lawyer. The room was nearly filled with smoke now, visibility down to perhaps 10 feet. The heat intense enough that Gideon's skin felt tight. They couldn't remain here much longer. The fire would kill them all if they didn't break out or suffocate first. But Gideon controlled the exits, and the exits were his leverage. "I'm opening the east door," Gideon announced. "One at a time, you'll leave. Each man who walks through that door will write his confession in the courthouse yard, witnessed by me. Anyone who refuses stays here with the fire." "We could rush you," one of the brokers said. 5 against 1. "You could. Some of you might make it through the door before I empty this pistol. Want to bet your life you'd be one of the survivors?" The calculations played across their faces, fear and self-preservation warring with loyalty and shame. What would you do, trapped in a burning basement, your co-conspirators already dead, your choices reduced to confession or immolation? These men had terrorized others into submission using exactly this arithmetic. Calculate the cost of resistance versus the cost of compliance, then choose the less painful path. Now they faced their own calculus. inverted. Thornton broke. "I'll write it. Everything. Just get me out of here." "Captain, you coward!" Yancey started, but Thornton was already moving toward the east exit, hands raised, weapon holstered. Gideon covered him while working the lock with his free hand, never taking his eyes off the remaining four. The door swung open, revealing the exterior stairwell and cold November air. Thornton stumbled up the stairs, gulping oxygen, coughing out smoke. The two brokers followed, choosing survival over solidarity. That left Yancey alone with Gideon in the burning basement. Two men who understood each other perfectly. One had built his life on enforcing racial hierarchy through violence. The other had decided to dismantle that machinery using the same tools. Both knew this ended only one way. "You're making a mistake," Yancey said quietly. "Kill me, and you prove we were right about your kind. You become the savage we claimed you were. Let me live, and I'll spend every day hunting you." Gideon considered this. Then he shot Yancey in the stomach, the wound designed to cause maximum pain without immediate death. Yancey collapsed, gasping, hands pressed to the entry wound as blood pulsed between his fingers. Gideon stood over him, the pistol aimed at Yancey's head. "Your mistake was thinking I care what you believe about me. I'm not trying to prove I'm civilized. I'm proving I'm dangerous, and the difference matters." He pulled the trigger, ending Edmund Yancey's war. Gideon emerged from the basement into cold air that tasted like salvation. Behind him, smoke poured from the building, the fire consuming evidence and memory both, destroying the meeting place where terror had been planned. Above, stars wheeled in their courses, indifferent to human violence, marking time that rendered all cruelty temporary and all empires dust. The courthouse bell tower stood dark against the sky, its bell silent, waiting for someone to ring alarm or mourning or triumph. The same bronze casting different meanings depending on who pulled the rope. 3 men waited in the yard. Thornton, shivering despite his coat, and the 2 cotton brokers, whose names Gideon had learned during the confessions, but wouldn't remember by morning. They'd become functions rather than individuals, variables in an equation about complicity and consequence. The lookout was gone, having fled when smoke started pouring from the building. Smart. The kind of wisdom that kept young men alive when they were too junior to matter and too visible to hide. "Sit," Gideon commanded, gesturing to the courthouse steps with his pistol. The 3 men sat, and Gideon produced paper and pencil from his canvas bag, supplies he'd carried with the same certainty a carpenter carries his square and level, tools essential to the work. "Write everything. Don't summarize. Don't obscure. Treat this like testimony you'd give under oath, because that's exactly what it is." "And then what?" Thornton asked. "Then you live long enough to see whether federal justice exists." They wrote for 2 hours while Gideon stood watch and the courthouse burned behind them. Thornton's confession filled 7 pages, detailing 18 months of collaboration, 4 previous meetings, specific intelligence he'd provided about troop deployments and garrison priorities. He named the commander in Montgomery, who tacitly approved his discretion in local matters, effectively licensing him to ignore crimes he was sworn to prevent. The cotton brokers wrote 3 pages each, focusing on economic mechanisms, the mortgage schemes, the fraudulent weighings, the coordinated foreclosures that transferred black-owned land to white control under the legal fiction of debt collection. Gideon read each confession twice, noting names, dates, methods. The documents corroborated and extended what he'd learned through 3 months of observation, filling gaps. confirming suspicions, providing the kind of systematic documentation that could survive a courtroom scrutiny. Not that he trusted courtrooms. The war had taught him that institutions designed to protect one group's power rarely dispensed justice to another. But he believed in creating evidence, in making the cost of silence higher than the cost of speaking. The sun rose at 6:47, lighting the eastern sky with colors that turned the courthouse smoke golden. Selma woke to the sight. Flames consuming the building where their government had sat, where deeds had been recorded and justice theoretically administered, now becoming a pyre for men who'd perverted those functions. The fire bell rang finally, pulled by early risers who spotted the blaze, and soon a crowd gathered. Merchants and laborers, black and white, all staring at the destruction while asking questions no one could yet answer. Gideon waited until perhaps 50 people had assembled before making his final move. He forced the 3 survivors to stand, positioned them facing the crowd, and announced in a voice that carried across the yard, "These men are confessed members of the Ku Klux Klan. Last night they met with 9 others to plan the murder of 24 black citizens before the election. The 9 are dead inside the courthouse. These 3 have written confessions detailing 18 months of terrorism, naming officials in Selma and Montgomery who enabled their crimes. I'm turning them over to federal custody along with these documents, with the understanding that if justice is not done, I will finish what I started." The crowd's reaction split predictably. Black faces showed shock mixed with something harder to name, not quite joy, but perhaps satisfaction that consequences had finally arrived. White faces showed horror and calculation, some because they'd supported the Klan, others because they understood the precedent being set. The powerless had claimed power, and the machinery of control had failed to prevent it. A few looked relieved, merchants who'd quietly opposed the violence but had been too afraid or too complicit to speak against it. Thornton tried to protest. "This is kidnapping, false imprisonment. These confessions were coerced." "Were the confessions you heard last night coerced?" Gideon asked. "When those men planned to burn me alive, was I coercing them by existing? You can argue legal procedure later, Captain. Right now, you're going to walk to the garrison, and you're going to explain to your superiors why a federal officer attended Klan meetings while his soldiers thought he was conducting town patrols." Federal troops arrived within the hour, responding to reports of the fire and the growing crowd. The lieutenant leading them, a young New Yorker named Morrison, who'd fought at Gettysburg and believed in the cause, if not always the execution, read Thornton's confession with an expression that cycled through disbelief, anger, and disgust. He placed Thornton under arrest, took custody of the 2 brokers, and promised Gideon that the confessions would reach Washington. Whether that promise meant anything would be tested in coming weeks. "The others inside?" Morrison asked, gesturing to the burning courthouse. "Edmund Yancey and 8 co-conspirators. They resisted." Morrison studied Gideon's face, the blood-spattered clothes, the knife still visible in his belt, the exhaustion that went deeper than one sleepless night. "You fought them alone, all 9. They weren't soldiers, Lieutenant. They were planters playing at guerrilla warfare. There's a difference. And you're a carpenter." "I'm a lot of things. Carpenter is just what I do during daylight." The federal troops secured the scene, kept the crowd back while the fire consumed what remained of the courthouse's interior. The basement collapsed around noon, taking the bodies with it into rubble that would take weeks to excavate. That bought time for certain truths to settle in Selma's memory before the physical evidence could be examined. By the time investigators sifted ash and bone, the story would already be fixed. A clan meeting went wrong, ended in violence. The courthouse burned. Whether the details included Gideon's role would depend on who controlled the narrative. Daniel appeared around 2 in the afternoon, having heard the news in the quarters and come to verify with his own eyes. He found Gideon sitting on the slave auction platform, the same boards where human beings had been sold, now serving as a seat for a man who'd claimed his own liberation through violence. "Did you kill them all?" Daniel asked. "Most. 3 are in federal custody." "And now?" "Now we see whether institutions do what they're supposed to, or whether I have to finish it myself." Daniel sat beside him, and the 2 men watched smoke rise from the courthouse ruins, adding ash to air already thick with burning. "My children are still hiding," Daniel said quietly. "Rachel's still dead. Killing Yancey doesn't bring her back, doesn't make my kids safe." What did this actually accomplish? It was the right question, the one Gideon had been asking himself since dawn. It proved they're not invincible. It proved that organization can be disrupted, that power concentrated in 12 men can be eliminated in one night. Will it stop the clan? No. There are other chapters, other counties, other planters who will step into Yancey's place. But it might make them more afraid, and fear changes calculations. "Your letter," Daniel said, producing the sealed envelope Gideon had left with him. "You want this back? Keep it. If the confessions disappear, if Thornton gets quietly reassigned, if nothing changes, you'll know what to do with it." They sat in silence while the day passed from afternoon to evening, watching Selma absorb the news, watching the white power structure try to understand what had happened and what it meant. Some would learn the right lessons, that terror invited counter-terror, that oppression wasn't cost-free, that the social order they'd built on violence was vulnerable to the same methods they'd used to construct it. Others would learn only that they needed better security, tighter organization, more ruthless enforcement. The cycle would continue because cycles always did, until something larger than individual resistance broke the pattern. But for one night, in one courthouse basement, the mathematics had inverted. The hunters became hunted, the planners became casualties, and a black carpenter with a knife and a revolver demonstrated what one determined person could accomplish against organized evil when they refused to accept the choice between submission and death. The election was still 3 days away. The ruins smoldered through the weekend. Federal troops established a perimeter around the collapsed courthouse, preventing souvenir hunters and the curious from disturbing what Lieutenant Morrison called a crime scene, though whose crime remained deliberately ambiguous. Thornton sat in a cell at the garrison, writing additional statements, elaborating on his original confession, perhaps hoping cooperation would mitigate his role. The 2 cotton brokers had been transferred to Montgomery under armed guard, their fate to be determined by officers who preferred having problems solved far from their immediate jurisdiction. Gideon returned to his workshop on Saturday morning, November 9th, and found it intact. Yancey's plan to burn him in his sleep would never be executed, the operational details having died with the planners. But other threats remained. The clan wasn't 12 men in a basement. It was a network spanning counties and states, and cutting one node didn't kill the system. Gideon understood this. He'd cut the head from the Dallas County operation, but the body would thrash, and in thrashing might cause more damage than when it had been coordinated and controlled. He spent Saturday repairing the lock on his door, reinforcing the window frames, positioning furniture to create obstacles for anyone who entered at night. The precautions felt inadequate but necessary, the actions of someone who'd learned that survival required constant vigilance, that relaxing meant dying. He cleaned his revolver, reloaded it, and kept it within reach while he worked on finishing the sideboard commission that had been interrupted by the previous night's violence. The normalcy of planing wood and fitting joints felt surreal after what he'd done, but he needed the routine, needed to demonstrate that he remained functional, that killing 9 men hadn't broken something essential inside him. Moses visited midday, bringing news from the quarters. People are scared and excited at the same time, he reported. Scared because they think there'll be retaliation. Excited because it happened at all. Because someone finally hit back and lived to tell about it. They're asking if it's safe to vote on Tuesday. I don't know, Gideon admitted. Yancey's gone, but his people aren't. The organization will try to restore control, prove they're still dangerous. It might get worse before it gets better. So what do we do? You vote. All of you. That's what they were trying to prevent, which means it's exactly what needs to happen. I'll be watching the polling places on Tuesday. If anyone tries what Yancey planned, they'll face the same result. Moses studied him with an expression Gideon couldn't quite read, something between respect and concern. You look tired, Moses said. When's the last time you slept? Before the war. I'll sleep when this is over. But sleep came anyway that Saturday night, dragging Gideon down into blackness deeper than the courthouse basement, punctuated by dreams he wouldn't remember, but would wake from sweating and reaching for weapons that were already in his hand. The cost of violence was always extracted later, in moments of vulnerability when the mind stopped suppressing what the body had done. He'd learned this in Tennessee after his first kill, when he'd vomited behind a tree and shaken for an hour before his hands steadied. The killing didn't get easier with repetition, it just became more familiar. The horror wearing grooves in his consciousness that other experiences could flow through without creating new trauma. Sunday brought church, and with it the delicate question of how to pray after committing premeditated murder. Gideon attended the African Methodist Episcopal service at 10 in the morning, sitting in his usual pew near the back, listening to the minister preach about Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, about walls falling when righteousness prevailed. The parallels were obvious enough that several congregants glanced at Gideon during the sermon, connecting biblical metaphor to recent events. After the service, people approached him, some to shake his hand, others to whisper thanks, a few to warn that Yancey's family was already meeting with lawyers and politicians, preparing some form of response. They can't charge you, one man said, a school teacher named Coleman who'd fought with the United States colored troops. You were defending yourself and the community. Castle doctrine applies, doesn't it? Castle doctrine protects people in their homes, not people who invade a basement to kill conspirators, Gideon replied. What I did was assassination, not self-defense. Whether it was justified is a different question from whether it was legal. Coleman absorbed this, then asked what everyone wanted to know. Will you run? Head north before they can organize a response? Where would I run to? I'm not trying to escape consequences. I'm trying to change them. The answer satisfied some, troubled others. But it was true. Gideon wasn't interested in merely surviving. He'd survived the war, survived watching his family sold away, survived 3 years of rebuilding a life that felt provisional and temporary. What he wanted now was to establish that power could be contested, that the social order imposed after Confederate defeat wasn't inevitable, that black men could claim the dignity and autonomy they'd been promised when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and the 14th Amendment theoretically guaranteed citizenship. The courthouse basement had been one blow in a larger fight, and running would negate everything he'd accomplished. Monday brought the Dallas Herald's response, printed on the newspaper's emergency press after the main office had been damaged by fire spreading from the courthouse. The editorial, written by the publisher himself, was a masterpiece of evasion and implication. A tragic conflagration. The destruction of our courthouse represents a grievous loss to Dallas County, both architecturally and symbolically. That this destruction occurred during a private gathering of prominent citizens engaged in civic discussion compounds the tragedy. While reports suggest criminal actions may have precipitated the fire, the loss of life is to be mourned regardless of circumstance. We call upon federal authorities to conduct a thorough investigation and to ensure that justice, tempered with mercy, is served to all involved. The editorial managed to avoid naming Gideon, avoid acknowledging the Klan meeting, avoid mentioning the confessions now in federal custody, and avoid taking any position that might alienate potential advertisers. It was a document designed to satisfy no one while offending no one. The journalism of a man trying to survive in a community split between those who'd supported the Klan and those who'd suffered under it. But the next page carried something more revealing. A notice of a special meeting of the Dallas County Agricultural Society, scheduled for Monday evening at the Masonic Hall. The society was the kind of organization planters joined for networking and influence, and its membership overlapped substantially with the Klan. Gideon read the notice twice, recognizing it as code. The organization was regrouping, selecting new leadership, deciding how to respond. Whether that response would be conciliatory or retaliatory remained to be seen. He attended that meeting, not inside, but watching from across the street, noting who entered and how long they stayed. 23 men, all white, all landowners or merchants. They met for 90 minutes, departed separately, faces grim and determined. Gideon recognized 7 of them as associates of Yancey's firm, men who'd benefited from the mortgage schemes and foreclosures. Within hours, word spread through the black community. White Selma was organizing polling place monitors for Tuesday's election, ostensibly to prevent fraud, actually to intimidate voters through presence and observation. "They're not bringing guns," Moses reported that evening. "At least not openly. They're calling it civic responsibility, making sure the election is conducted properly." "Intimidation doesn't require weapons," Gideon said. "Just presence. Just the reminder that they're watching, that they remember who votes, that there will be time after the election to settle accounts." "So we don't vote? We let them win through fear?" "No. We vote. And I'll be there too, watching the watchers." Monday night, Gideon didn't sleep. He sat at his work table, cleaning his revolver again, checking the knife's edge, and thinking about the election that would determine whether the previous 3 days had meant anything. 12 hours remained until the polls opened. 12 hours for the white power structure to decide whether to accept the new reality or to push back against it. 12 hours for Gideon to prepare for whatever came next. The mathematics of power were simple. Force worked until it met greater force. Institutions mattered until individuals ignored them. Law constrained behavior until someone decided the cost of breaking the law was less than the benefit. Gideon had broken every law against murder on Thursday night, and no one had arrested him because the men who'd enforced those laws were either dead or compromised, or calculating whether prosecution would create more problems than it solved. That calculation would determine whether he'd hang or whether he'd become something else. An example, a warning, a symbol of what happened when oppression pushed too hard. He watched the sun rise on November 12, 1867, knowing this day would answer questions that violence alone couldn't resolve. The polling place for Selma's Western District, occupied a rented storefront on Broad Street. A narrow room with a single table, 2 chairs, and a ballot box guarded by a federal soldier, whose youth and uncertainty made him almost decorative. Voting was scheduled from 7 in the morning until 7 in the evening. 12 hours for eligible men to exercise the franchise that had been paid for in blood and constitutional amendment. The reality was more complicated than the theory, which was why Gideon arrived at 6:30 to observe. The white monitors had claimed positions by 6:45. 15 men, arranged in a loose semicircle around the storefront entrance, standing on public sidewalk where their presence was technically legal. They carried no visible weapons, wore no hoods, engaged in no explicit threats. They simply stood, arms crossed, watching. When black men approached to vote, the monitors watched them. When black men entered the polling place, the monitors noted their faces. When black men departed, the monitors followed them with their eyes until distance made tracking impossible. The message required no words. We know who you are, we'll remember. There will be consequences. Gideon positioned himself across the street, leaning against a storefront wall like someone waiting for the mercantile to open, his coat hanging loose to conceal the revolver at his belt. He watched the monitors watch the voters, creating a surveillance network where everyone observed everyone else, where every action occurred in multiple contexts simultaneously. The official context of legal voting, the unofficial context of intimidation, and the contested context of who would ultimately control the county's political future. The first black voter arrived at 7:02. A field hand named Jefferson, 40 years old, who'd saved enough to buy 10 acres and who understood that voting determined whether his taxes would fund schools for his children or would be siphoned into projects that benefited only white landowners. Jefferson approached the polling place, saw the monitors, hesitated. The monitors said nothing, just watched. Jefferson glanced across the street, saw Gideon, seemed to draw strength from that presence, and continued forward. He entered the storefront, remained inside for 3 minutes, emerged with his shoulders squared and his expression neutral. The monitors let him pass. He walked down Broad Street, turned the corner, and disappeared. First vote cast. By 9 o'clock, 23 black men had voted, a number that represented both courage and calculation. Each man had weighed the risks, retaliation, economic pressure, violence, against the benefit of participating in governance, of mattering in a system designed to make them irrelevant. The mathematics varied by individual circumstance. A man who owned land had more to lose than a field hand who could move to the next county if things got too dangerous. A man with children calculated differently than a man alone. A man with memory of slavery calculated differently than a young man who'd been born free. But each calculation resulted in the same action: walking past the monitors, entering the polling place, marking a ballot. The monitors' strategy revealed itself around 10 o'clock. They began engaging voters in conversation, not threatening, just talking. Good morning. Fine day for exercising your rights. You know, the Republican candidate wants to raise property taxes by 15%. That'll hit you hard if you own land. The numbers were fabricated or distorted, but spoken with such casual authority that some voters hesitated, unsure what was true, wondering if they were making a mistake. The monitors were weaponizing uncertainty, making the act of voting feel complicated and dangerous, even when the physical mechanics were simple. Gideon crossed the street at 10:15, positioning himself directly between the monitors and the polling place entrance. His presence changed the dynamic immediately. The monitors, who'd been comfortable intimidating individuals, became uncertain when faced with someone who'd killed 9 of their associates 3 days earlier. He said nothing, just stood, creating a physical barrier that voters could pass through without confronting the monitors directly. The symbolism was clear. Vote under my protection and face me if you want to prevent it. One of the monitors, a merchant named Caldwell, who'd been among those meeting at the Masonic Hall Monday night, finally spoke. "You're obstructing public sidewalk, Ward. I'm standing on public property, same as you. If you've got objections, call the sheriff. The sheriff's dead, burned in the courthouse. Then I guess you'll have to tolerate my presence." The confrontation had the potential to escalate, but neither side wanted violence here, on a public street, with federal soldiers 50 feet away. The monitors had come to intimidate, not to fight. Gideon had come to ensure intimidation failed, not to start a battle that would justify federal intervention and possibly suspension of the election. So they stood in mutual tension, glaring across 3 feet of space, while voters continued to arrive and pass between them. By noon, 74 black men had voted. The number mattered because the total registered black voters in the district was approximately 260. Even with intimidation, even with the implicit threat of retaliation, more than a quarter had participated by midday. If that ratio held through the afternoon, turnout would exceed expectations and possibly swing the county's results toward Republican candidates who supported Reconstruction. The mathematics of democracy were simple. More votes won, and the monitors were failing to suppress enough participation to guarantee their preferred outcome. Lunch brought a shift in tactics. 3 monitors departed and returned 30 minutes later with Josiah Clemens, one of the 2 cotton brokers Gideon had spared Thursday night. Clemens was free on his own recognizance, having posted bond in Montgomery and returned to Selma pending trial. His presence was a message. The system protects us even when we're caught. Consequences are theoretical. Power persists regardless of violence or law. Clemens positioned himself at the front of the monitor line and stared at Gideon with naked hatred. "You should be in a cell," Clemens said. "You murdered 9 men. The only reason you're free is that you terrorized the witnesses into silence. I took 3 confessions. The only reason you're free is that white criminals get bond while black men don't. This isn't over, Ward. You know that, right? Thursday was one night. This is forever. We'll outlast you because we have resources, organization, patience. You're just one man with a gun." Gideon smiled the same way he'd smiled in the basement before starting the killing. "Keep thinking that, Clemens. It's easier to hunt prey that believes it's predator." The exchange drew attention from the federal soldier guarding the ballot box. The young private stepped outside, rifle held across his chest in a posture that was meant to look neutral, but actually constituted intervention. "Gentlemen, please maintain order. The polling place operates under federal protection, and any disturbance will result in arrests." "We're simply observing," Clemens replied smoothly. "Ensuring no fraud occurs. That's our civic duty." The soldier looked at Gideon, uncertain what to do with a man who was simultaneously a victim of terrorism and a perpetrator of mass murder. "Sir, are you here to vote?" "Already voted. I'm here to make sure others can do the same without interference. The law permits observers. The law also prohibits intimidation. These men are here to frighten voters, and you know it. You can arrest them for that, or you can let me continue providing counter-presence. Your choice." The soldier was maybe 22 years old, fresh from somewhere north of the Mason-Dixon line, trained to follow orders but given none that covered this specific scenario. He made the rational decision. Retreat to the polling place. Maintain neutrality. Let the situation resolve itself. It was the same decision Captain Thornton had made repeatedly over the previous 18 months. The passive complicity that allowed terror to flourish while technically following regulations against direct involvement. But the soldiers' retreat emboldened Clemens. You're going to hang, Ward. Maybe not today, maybe not this month, but eventually. Federal protection won't last forever. Reconstruction will end, and when it does, we'll still be here. We'll remember, and we'll collect what's owed. Looking forward to it, Gideon said. Then, louder, addressing the black voters who'd been watching this confrontation. Anyone who wants to vote but hasn't yet, now's the time. Walk between us. Exercise your rights. Let's see if these men have the courage to do more than talk. Chapter 11. The ballot box overflows. The afternoon brought waves of voters, encouraged by word spreading through the quarters that the polling place was protected, that the monitors could watch but couldn't prevent, that voting was possible despite the risks. Old men who'd been enslaved their entire lives until 2 years ago. Young men who'd been born just before emancipation and were voting in their first election. Field hands and craftsmen, sharecroppers and small property owners, united by the mathematics that their collective participation could swing results if they showed up in sufficient numbers. By 3 o'clock, the ballot box was nearly full, and Lieutenant Morrison arrived from the garrison with a second box. He'd heard reports of the confrontation, had come to assess whether federal intervention was necessary, and found a standoff that looked tense but controlled. He pulled Gideon aside for a conversation that occurred in low voices away from the monitors. "You're creating complications," Morrison said without preamble. "Washington is watching this election. They want it to proceed smoothly, to demonstrate that Reconstruction can work. Violence on polling day, even prevented violence, gives opponents ammunition. So I should let these men intimidate voters? That's what you're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that your presence raises tensions. You killed 9 people Thursday night. Half the white population wants you arrested. The other half wants you dead. Standing here escalates things. And if I leave, the monitors get what they want. Voters see that federal protection is meaningless, that the same men who planned their murders can now police their voting. What message does that send?" Morrison had no good answer because the question revealed the fundamental contradiction of Reconstruction. How to enforce rights without using force. How to protect the previously enslaved without antagonizing their former masters. How to square democracy with a white Southern establishment that viewed black voting as existential threat. The lieutenant was caught in that contradiction, ordered to maintain peace while knowing that true peace required choosing sides and accepting that some people would call that choice tyranny. "Just try not to start anything," Morrison said finally. "Let them watch. Let your people vote. If actual interference occurs, my men will intervene. But if you escalate, I have to arrest you, and that serves nobody." "Understood." Morrison departed, and Gideon returned to his position. The monitors had watched this exchange, drawing their own conclusions. They seemed to believe Morrison had warned Gideon off, that federal authority had been asserted, that the balance of power remained in their favor. That miscalculation would cost them. At 4:30, Daniel arrived to vote, bringing his 2 children despite the danger, wanting them to witness him exercising the franchise Rachel had died for. He walked past the monitors without acknowledging them, entered the polling place, marked his ballot, and emerged with his shoulders back and his face set. The monitors said nothing, perhaps because even they understood that harassing a widower and his children in daylight would be too visible, too obviously cruel. But Gideon saw how Daniel's hands shook, how the children pressed close to their father, how the simple act of voting carried weight that no one should have to bear. "You good?" Gideon asked quietly as Daniel passed. "I'm angry, but I'm good." By 6 o'clock, estimated turnout for black voters exceeded 60%, an astonishing number given the previous night's fears. The monitors had failed. Their presence had created fear, but not enough to prevent participation. Gideon's counter-presence had provided just enough protection, or the perception of protection, that voters felt emboldened. The mathematics had tipped toward courage rather than caution, toward participation rather than withdrawal. The monitors recognized this failure in real time, and it made them dangerous. Men who'd expected easy intimidation now faced the prospect of losing not just this election, but the larger battle over who controlled Dallas County's political future. Clemens began arguing with the other monitors, voices rising, tension escalating toward a decision point, where words either turned into action or dissipated into resentful acceptance. At 6:40, with 20 minutes remaining before polls closed, a group of 10 white men approached from the east, walking in formation, faces set. They weren't monitors who'd been standing there all day. These were fresh arrivals, possibly summoned by Clemens when he realized turnout was defying expectations. They wore work clothes and carried tools that could be weapons: axe handles, hammer handles, lengths of chain. The message was clear. Intimidation had failed. Time for escalation. Gideon recognized 3 of them as associates of Edmund Yancey, men who worked at the cotton factor's firm and who'd likely known about Thursday's meeting even if they hadn't attended. They approached the polling place entrance with deliberate purpose, intending either to block access or to spark a confrontation that would justify federal closure of the polls. Either outcome served their interests. Preventing the final 20 minutes of voting would reduce black turnout, and violence would provide ammunition for arguments that the freedmen weren't ready for political participation. But they'd miscalculated who else was watching. Moses and 15 other black men emerged from positions around the square where they'd been waiting for exactly this scenario. Not armed, not organized into a fighting force, just present in numbers that changed the arithmetic. The white group stopped, reassessing, recognizing that forcing entry would mean fighting through a crowd rather than intimidating individuals. Federal soldiers moved from the garrison toward the polling place, drawn by the gathering crowd, adding another layer of complexity. "Polls close in 15 minutes, Lieutenant Morrison announced, his voice carrying authority underwritten by the rifles his men carried. "Anyone attempting to disrupt voting will be arrested. Anyone eligible who hasn't voted should do so now." The white group hesitated, leadership unclear, purpose frustrated. They'd come to act decisively, but found the situation too complicated, too witnessed, too laden with consequences they hadn't been prepared to accept. After 30 seconds of indecision, they withdrew, not fleeing but strategically retreating to preserve the option of acting later under better conditions. The last voters entered at 6:58, marked their ballots, and departed. At 7 o'clock precisely, the federal soldier closed and locked the ballot boxes, began the process of counting votes under Morrison's supervision, and transformed the street confrontation into a waiting game where results would determine whether Thursday's violence had mattered. Gideon remained until the count was complete, until Morrison announced the preliminary totals. In the Western District, Republican candidates had won by margins of 17 to 43%, numbers that exceeded all predictions, and that, when combined with results from other districts, would likely swing multiple county offices to Reconstruction supporters. The election wasn't everything. Votes didn't end the Klan, didn't resurrect the dead, didn't compensate for decades of slavery or 2 years of Reconstruction violence. But votes mattered because they demonstrated that participation was possible, that the social order could be contested through legal means, that power wasn't absolute. The monitors dispersed without comment, their failure complete. Gideon walked back to his workshop through streets that felt different somehow. Not safer, not transformed, just different. He'd killed 9 men, terrorized 3 others into confession, forced a federal officer to face his own complicity, and enabled an election that might change nothing or might change everything depending on what happened next. The price for all of that was still being calculated, and he suspected he'd be paying it for whatever remained of his life. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. The election results were certified, triggering celebrations in Black Selma and grim resignation in White Selma. The new county commissioners included 2 black men, the first since Reconstruction began. The new sheriff was a white unionist who'd opposed secession, fought for the Confederacy under duress, and now promised equal enforcement of law regardless of race. A promise everyone understood would be tested repeatedly. The new clerk of courts announced that he'd prioritize rebuilding the courthouse record room before the courtrooms themselves, suggesting that documentation and evidence would be privileged over the symbols of authority. But 3 days wasn't long enough to determine whether the election marked a turning point or merely a pause before the white establishment regrouped. The Klan hadn't vanished. It had lost leadership and momentum, but the network remained intact across Alabama, and reorganization was inevitable. Clemens and the other freed cotton broker faced trial in Montgomery, but their lawyer was already arguing that the confessions had been coerced under duress and should be inadmissible. Captain Thornton had been quietly transferred to a desk position in Washington, neither punished nor exonerated. His career preserved through the same political calculations that had enabled his complicity in the first place. Gideon spent those 3 days working in his shop, completing the sideboard commission, building a chair set for a school teacher, repairing a table that had survived the courthouse fire. The routine of carpentry felt necessary, grounding him in the tangible world of measurements and joints and grain patterns. But he slept poorly, woke often, and found himself checking locks and windows with the vigilance of someone who understood that survival required constant attention. On the evening of November 15th, Moses brought news that the Agricultural Society had met again. 20 men this time, including several who'd been at the Masonic Hall meeting. They discussed organizational changes and preserving community standards, coded language for rebuilding the Klan's infrastructure. Names had been circulated, assignments made, territories defined. The meeting had lasted 3 hours, ending with agreement that certain matters required resolution before the new county government took office in January. "Your name came up," Moses said quietly. "They're calling you the carpenter who thinks he's an army. They're saying Thursday was luck, that if they'd been prepared, you'd never have succeeded. They're talking about making an example, showing that consequences still apply. Let them talk. Talk is cheap. Talk precedes action, though. You know that." Gideon knew. He'd spent too many years as a scout not to recognize the pattern. Assessment, planning, execution. The white establishment was in the assessment phase, measuring the problem, gauging responses, deciding whether eliminating Gideon would restore their authority, or whether killing him would create a martyr who'd inspire more resistance. The calculation was delicate, and Gideon's survival depended on making the cost of killing him higher than the benefit. That night, he didn't go home. Instead, he walked to the courthouse ruins, drawn by instinct or memory or the need to see what his violence had created. The basement had been partially excavated, revealing scorched bricks and charred timbers and the remains of 9 men who'd planned murder and found it instead. The county had hired laborers to clear the rubble, but the work proceeded slowly, partly from lack of funds, but mostly from lack of will. No one wanted to dig in those ashes, to handle bones that carried the weight of justified but unlawful killing. Gideon stood at the edge of the excavation, looking down into the space where he'd dropped from the ceiling and started cutting. The smell of burned wood still lingered, mixing with November's cold air, creating a scent memory he'd carry forever. He thought about the men he'd killed, not with regret exactly, but with recognition that their deaths had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully measure. Before Thursday night, he'd been a survivor, someone who'd endured slavery's breakup of his family and the war's carnage and Reconstruction's broken promises. Now he was something else, an executioner, a terrorist, a symbol, a warning. The transformation felt necessary and terrible in equal measure. "They're coming for you," a voice said from behind him. Gideon turned to find Daniel standing in the shadows, a shotgun cradled in his arms. When? Tonight. Maybe an hour from now. Maybe less. One of the housemaids at the Agricultural Society heard them planning. They're meeting at the old Pritchard barn, same place they used before. 20 men. They're calling it a retrieval operation, saying you need to face trial for Thursday's murders. But we both know they're not bringing you to any courthouse. How many are you? 32. All armed. All ready to fight if you give the word. Here was the choice Gideon had been avoiding since Thursday. Whether to remain a lone actor, controlled and contained, or to become a leader of something larger that could spiral beyond his control. 32 men willing to fight meant 32 lives at risk. 32 families that could be destroyed if things went wrong. It meant transforming a single act of targeted violence into organized resistance, crossing a line from assassination to insurrection. "No," Gideon said. "If they want me, let them come. But not you, not anyone else. This stays between me and them." That's suicide. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way this ends without a massacre. They're coming for me specifically because I'm one man they can target without igniting open warfare. If I meet them with 32 fighters, that's the excuse they need to bring in militia, declare martial law, start arresting people. But if I handle it alone, the way I handled Thursday, it stays surgical. It stays about individuals rather than communities. Daniel understood the logic, but rejected the conclusion. You can't fight 20 men alone. Thursday you had surprise, position, preparation. This time they're ready. They know what you can do. They'll shoot you from 100 yards out and call it justice served. Gideon smiled. Then I better make sure they can't find me to shoot. He spent the next hour preparing, not for defense, but for offense. He knew where the Pritchard barn was. He'd noted it during his earlier surveillance as one of the clan's rotating meeting places. He knew the approaches, the sight lines, the cover available in the surrounding tree line. And he knew that 20 men organized to hunt him would be focused on his workshop, his likely routes, the places he was known to frequent. They wouldn't expect him to attack their staging point, to strike before they could execute their own plan. The barn stood 2 miles east of town, a sagging structure that hadn't housed livestock in years and now served as storage for abandoned equipment and occasional shelter for vagrants. Gideon approached from the south, moving through pine forest, using the trees and darkness to close distance without exposure. He arrived at 10:30, positioning himself in the tree line 70 yards from the barn's north entrance, and watched as the hunters gathered. They came in small groups, riding or walking, converging on the barn with the practiced coordination of men who'd done this before. Gideon counted them. 23, not 20. The number had grown since Daniel's warning, suggesting either enthusiasm for the mission or difficulty saying no when asked to participate in community defense. Most carried rifles. Several had pistols visible in belt holsters. A few had brought rope, presumably for binding Gideon if they took him alive. Though everyone understood that was unlikely. The barn's interior glowed with lantern light, illuminating the planning session. Gideon couldn't hear the specifics, but he recognized the pattern. Map consultation, route assignments, timing coordination. They were treating this like a military operation, which was smart except for one flaw. They'd assumed Gideon would react defensively, would fortify his position, or run, or try to hide. They hadn't considered that he might come for them instead. He waited until midnight, when the planning concluded, and men began moving toward horses tied outside the barn. The operation was launching, hunters heading to surround Gideon's workshop, to trap him the way he'd trapped their associates Thursday. But they'd left their rear exposed, confident that no one would attack 23 armed men at their own staging point. Confidence made them careless. Gideon shot the first man from 70 yards, the rifle crack splitting the night, the target dropping before anyone registered what had happened. He'd borrowed a Springfield from Moses, a military rifle with better range and accuracy than his revolver, and he'd positioned himself to cover the barn's exits. The second shot took another man trying to mount his horse. The third shattered a lantern inside the barn, plunging the interior into darkness and spreading fire across hay bales that hadn't been removed when the barn stopped serving livestock. Chaos erupted, men scattering, some running for cover, others trying to identify where the shots had originated, a few returning fire blindly toward the tree line. Gideon had already moved, circling west, taking a new position that covered a different angle. He shot twice more, both hits, both men falling, before the return fire found his previous location and tore bark from trees he was no longer behind. The barn was burning now, flames consuming dry timber, forcing the men inside to evacuate or die. They poured out the exits, silhouetting themselves against the firelight, making themselves perfect targets. Gideon shot 3 more in quick succession, dropping them before they reached cover, demonstrating the same ruthless efficiency he'd shown Thursday. The hunters were learning what their associates had learned in the courthouse basement, that fighting Gideon Ward required accepting casualties they weren't prepared to absorb. Return fire intensified as the survivors organized, bracketing the tree line with overlapping fields of fire, forcing Gideon to stay down. He'd killed 8, wounded possibly 2 more, but the remaining survivors were finding discipline, overcoming their initial panic, starting to work as a unit. If he stayed here, they'd flank him, surround him, end this through superior numbers. Time to shift tactics. He ran west through the forest, using terrain and darkness to break contact, emerging 200 yards from the barn and circling back toward town. Behind him, the barn fire illuminated the night sky, a beacon that would draw attention from Selma, bring federal troops to investigate, transform this ambush into a public incident that would require official response. That suited Gideon's purposes perfectly. He'd disrupted the hunting party, killed enough of them that the survivors would spend the rest of the night evacuating casualties rather than pursuing him, and created evidence of organized violence that the new county government couldn't ignore. but he'd also guaranteed escalation. The white establishment had just lost 8 more men, bringing the total casualties to 17 over 5 days. That kind of attrition demanded response, and the response would come soon, probably overwhelmingly. Gideon had bought time, days, maybe a week, but he'd also ensured that the next confrontation would be decisive, that one side or the other would have to prevail completely, because there was no longer any middle ground. He reached his workshop at 1 a.m, barred the door, and waited for dawn with the rifle across his knees and the knowledge that he'd probably just signed his own death warrant. Lieutenant Morrison reached Gideon's workshop at 6 a.m, accompanied by a full platoon of federal infantry and a major from Montgomery, whose presence announced that Washington's attention had finally focused on Dallas County. The major's name was Theodore Ashford, a Massachusetts man who'd commanded black troops during the war and who approached Reconstruction with the zealotry of someone who believed the Confederacy's defeat should mean something more than geographical reunification. "Mr. Ward," Ashford said formally, standing on the street while his soldiers surrounded the block, "I'm here to investigate last night's incident at the Pritchard barn and to determine whether federal law has been violated. I need to take your statement regarding your involvement in that action and in the events of November 8th. Gideon unlocked his door and invited Ashford inside, recognizing that cooperation was now the only strategy available. Running would confirm guilt. Fighting would justify whatever response Ashford chose to deploy. But cooperation, providing testimony, documentation, context, might transform him from criminal to witness, from murderer to someone who'd enforced law that local authorities had failed to uphold. They talked for 3 hours. Gideon walked Ashford through everything: the tight surveillance of Klan meetings, the murder of Thomas Hawkins and Jacob Williams and Rachel Turner, the conversation with Daniel about resistance, the decision to raid the courthouse basement on November 8th, the confessions extracted from Thornton and the cotton brokers, the Election Day standoff, and finally the ambush at Pritchard Barn. He held back nothing, recognizing that partial truth would be worse than silence, that his only chance at surviving with any legitimacy required exposing everything and letting federal authority decide what to do with the information. Ashford listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather journal, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly letting Gideon's narrative flow uninterrupted. When Gideon finished, the major sat in silence for several minutes, reading his notes, processing implications. "You've admitted to 17 homicides," Ashford said finally. 9 on November 8th, 8 last night. Under Alabama law, that's multiple counts of murder regardless of motive. The state would be within its rights to seek your arrest and prosecution. "Yes, sir." "However, Alabama law doesn't control here. This county is under military occupation pursuant to the Reconstruction Acts. I have authority to supersede state law where necessary to protect federal interests. The question I'm wrestling with is whether your actions advanced or undermined those interests." "And?" Ashford leaned back in his chair. "The Klan has been terrorizing this county for 18 months. We've filed reports, made recommendations, requested resources to combat the violence. Washington sent forms and bureaucracy and orders to maintain peace without creating incidents that northern newspapers could exploit. Captain Thornton interpreted those orders as permission to do nothing, which allowed the violence to escalate. You, on the other hand, eliminated the Dallas County Klan leadership in a single night and disrupted their reorganization attempt 5 days later. From a purely tactical standpoint, you accomplished in 1 week what we failed to accomplish in 18 months. But you did it through premeditated murder, which sets a precedent that terrifies everyone. If private citizens can decide which laws apply and which don't, if violence is acceptable when institutions fail, then we have anarchy rather than democracy. You're asking me to endorse a principle that undermines everything I've fought to establish. The conversation had reached its core tension, whether justice required institutions or whether individuals could claim authority when institutions failed. Gideon had no answer that wouldn't sound self-serving, so he offered observation instead. Sir, every enslaved person in this county has been waiting their entire lives for institutions to protect them. First, they waited for slave owners to develop conscience. Then they waited for northern armies to win the war. Then they waited for constitutional amendments to guarantee rights. Then they waited for federal troops to enforce those rights. At some point, waiting becomes complicity. I stopped waiting. If that's a crime, prosecute me. But don't pretend the alternative was justice. The alternative was more bodies, more families destroyed, more elections stolen through terror. Ashford absorbed this, then asked the question that would determine everything. If I decline to prosecute, what do you do next? Do you continue hunting Klan members? Do you become a vigilante who decides which white Southerners live and which die? Where does this end? It ends when the institutions work. It ends when a black man can vote without being murdered, when a family can own land without being terrorized, when the law protects everyone instead of just the powerful. I don't want to be what I've become, Major. I want to build furniture and live quietly and believe that my nieces and nephews will grow up safe. But I can't make institutions work by myself. That's your job. I just did mine. I removed the people who made your job impossible. Now do yours. The Major stood, walked to the window, and stared out at Broad Street where morning commerce was beginning, despite the previous night's violence. Federal soldiers stood at intersections, a visible presence that said the military was taking control, that civilian authority had failed and was being superseded. After a long silence, Ashford spoke without turning around. I'm placing this county under direct military governance, effective immediately. All civilian officials will report to federal authority. All elections will proceed under military observation. All complaints of violence or intimidation will be investigated by federal personnel. And all irregular militia organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan, are hereby declared unlawful conspiracies subject to immediate suppression. This order remains in effect until I determine that local authorities can maintain law without federal intervention. He turned to face Gideon. You're free, Mr. Ward. Not because what you did was legal, but because prosecuting you would undermine everything I just announced. You've become a symbol whether you wanted to or not. The black community sees you as a defender. The white community sees you as a terrorist. I need you to disappear for a while. Let tensions ease. Let the new government establish itself. Can you do that? Where would I go? Anywhere but here. North, preferably. I'll provide travel papers and a stipend. Come back in 6 months, a year maybe, when things have stabilized. But staying now means every incident, every death, every act of violence will be blamed on you, whether you're involved or not. You'll be a lightning rod that attracts the very violence I'm trying to prevent. It was exile disguised as protection, forcing Gideon to choose between remaining to defend what he'd fought for or leaving to allow the institutions he didn't trust to prove themselves. But it was also pragmatic. Ashford was right that Gideon's presence would complicate everything, that both sides would use him as justification for actions that had nothing to do with him. Sometimes the strategic move was retreat. I'll leave, Gideon said. But I'm coming back, and if things haven't improved, If the Klan is still operating, if people are still dying, then we'll have this conversation again with different conclusions. Fair enough. Gideon left Selma on November 18th, 1867, carrying a canvas bag containing his tools, his revolver, his knife, and a letter of safe conduct signed by Major Ashford that identified him as a federal informant traveling under military protection. The train took him north through Alabama into Tennessee, past battlefields he'd scouted during the war, through mountains that had sheltered him when Confederate patrols came too close. He watched the landscape pass with the detachment of someone who'd survived by understanding geography, by knowing which ridges provided cover and which valleys became traps. He settled temporarily in Nashville, finding work at a carpentry shop that asked no questions about where he'd come from or why his hands bore the calluses of someone who'd done more than woodworking. The city was crowded with displaced people, former slaves seeking opportunity, former Confederates seeking anonymity, Northern transplants seeking fortune in the occupied South. Gideon blended into that chaos, building furniture 6 days a week and spending evenings in churches and meeting halls where freedmen organized mutual aid societies and debated politics and tried to build institutions that might outlast federal occupation. News from Dallas County arrived irregularly, filtered through newspapers and letters and travelers passing through Nashville. Major Ashford had arrested 14 men on conspiracy charges related to Klan activities, using the confessions Gideon had extracted and additional testimony that emerged once federal authority demonstrated willingness to prosecute. The trials proceeded slowly, delayed by lawyers and jurisdictional challenges, but 3 men had been convicted by January and were serving sentences in federal prisons. Captain Thornton had been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged, though he'd avoided prison through political connections and was reportedly working as a railroad surveyor in Texas. The new Dallas County government was functioning, though under military supervision that limited its independence. The Black County Commissioners had proposed tax reforms and school funding, but implementation was stalled by white opposition and federal caution about provoking backlash. The Klan had gone underground, no longer meeting openly, but rumors suggested continued activity in surrounding counties. The fragile peace Ashford had imposed was holding, but only because federal troops remained visible and enforcement remained credible. Daniel wrote in February, reporting that his children were in school, that he'd planted spring crops without incident, that the community was recovering slowly from 2 years of terror. "People still talk about you," Daniel wrote. "Some with admiration, some with fear, some with both. You've become a story we tell ourselves about what's possible when someone refuses to accept what we're told is inevitable. Whether that story helps or hurts, I can't say. But it's your story now, and stories have lives of their own." Gideon read that letter 3 times, understanding that he'd crossed a threshold between person and symbol, between individual action and collective memory. What he'd done in Selma would be retold and distorted and embellished, becoming legend that served purposes he couldn't control. Some would use his story to justify violence. Others would use it to argue that resistance was futile, that individual action couldn't change systems. Still others would remember only that 17 men had died, and that the killing had solved nothing permanent. All of those interpretations were partially true and completely inadequate. In April, Ashford wrote with an update. "The situation has stabilized sufficiently that I believe your return would not trigger immediate crisis. However, I cannot guarantee your safety. Elements of the white establishment blame you for the federal occupation, for the loss of their political power, for everything they've suffered since the war ended. Some have prices on your head, unofficial bounties that circulate in whispers. Others want to prosecute you for murder despite my previous decision not to pursue charges. You have friends here, certainly, but you also have enemies who will act on that enmity if given opportunity. My recommendation: stay away another year. Let more time pass. Let memories fade. But if you choose to return, do so with awareness that you're walking back into a conflict that has paused, not ended. Gideon returned in May, making that choice with full understanding of its cost. He'd survived by moving forward, by refusing to remain perpetually displaced, by believing that home was something to claim rather than something granted by others' tolerance. Selma was home, not because it was safe, not because it welcomed him, but because it was where he'd made his stand, where he'd refused to accept terror as inevitable, where he'd demonstrated that power could be contested even when the contest required violence. The train pulled into Selma's depot on May 7th, 1868, 6 months and 19 days after he'd left. The town looked different somehow, not transformed, just different. New construction had begun on the courthouse, federal engineers overseeing the work to ensure the basement would never again serve as a meeting place for conspirators. The slave auction platform had been torn down, the lumber sold to freedmen who used it to build additions to their cabins, transforming the site of their commodification into material for their homes. Small changes, incremental progress that might or might not survive federal withdrawal. Moses met him at the depot. People know you're back. Word spreads fast in a small town. Some are celebrating, others are nervous. Ashford wants to see you tomorrow morning, and Daniel asked me to tell you that Rachel's grave has flowers now, that her children planted them and tend them every Sunday after church. They walked through town toward Gideon's workshop, which Moses had maintained in his absence. The streets were busier than Gideon remembered, the economy recovering as cotton prices improved and federal contracts brought money to merchants and laborers. The changes were small, a new storefront here, a repaired road there, but collectively they suggested a community trying to move forward despite the weight of its past. The workshop stood exactly as he'd left it, tools arranged on the bench, half-finished projects waiting for completion. Gideon stood in the doorway for a long moment, breathing in the smell of pine shavings and linseed oil, feeling the weight of 6 months settle across his shoulders like a cloak. He was home, but home felt provisional now, something that could be taken away by forces beyond his control. "You think it's worth it?" Moses asked quietly. "All of it, the killing, the exile, the constant watching over your shoulder. Did it actually change anything?" Gideon thought about Thomas Hawkins and Jacob Williams and Rachel Turner, about the 24 names on Yancey's list, who would have died if the basement meeting had proceeded according to plan. He thought about the election that had happened, because people felt just safe enough to vote, about the 2 black county commissioners who were learning to govern despite opposition and obstacles. He thought about Daniel's children planting flowers on their mother's grave instead of hiding in root cellars while hooded men burned their home. "It changed some things," Gideon said finally. "Not everything. Maybe not even the most important things. But some things. And sometimes that's enough." In 1912, a historian from Atlanta came to Dallas County researching Reconstruction-era violence. She interviewed elderly residents, black and white, collecting oral histories that would be archived and mostly forgotten for another half-century. One interview was with a woman named Constance Ward, 83 years old, who had been Daniel's daughter, one of the children hiding in the root cellar the night Rachel was killed. "Tell me about Gideon Ward," the historian asked. Was he a hero or a criminal? The old woman thought for a long time before answering. He was a carpenter who was good at his trade. He was a soldier who survived a war that killed most men like him. He was a widower whose family was torn apart by people who thought they had the right to treat human beings as merchandise. And for 1 week in November 1867, he was something else, something harder to name. He killed 17 men. He terrified a community. He forced federal troops to take sides. He made people confront choices they'd been avoiding for 2 years. Was that heroic? Was it criminal? I was 8 years old, too young to judge. All I know is that my mother died in October, and my father and I survived to vote in November. And those two facts are connected somehow to what Gideon did in that courthouse basement. Make of that what you will. The historian pressed. What happened to him? Where did he end up? He lived in Selma until he died in 1909. Built furniture, attended church, voted in every election. People left him alone, mostly because they feared him, partly because they respected him, partly because they understood that if they came for him, he'd respond the way he'd always responded. He never married, never spoke publicly about November 8th or 15th, just lived quietly and made things with his hands and watched Dallas County struggle through the end of Reconstruction, through redemption, through Jim Crow, through all the years when the promises of freedom were broken and buried again and again. Whether his violence mattered, whether it changed trajectories or just momentarily interrupted them, I don't know. But I know we tell his story still, and we tell it because sometimes the powerless find power, and that's worth remembering even when the memory is uncomfortable. The interview ended there, filed in boxes that sat in university basements until graduate students rediscovered them in the 1970s. By then, all the principals were dead. Gideon, Daniel, Moses, Major Ashford, everyone who'd witnessed November 8th firsthand. What remained were documents, confessions, court records, newspaper accounts, and oral histories that contradicted each other about details while agreeing on the essential fact. In Reconstruction-era Alabama, one man killed 17 others and lived long enough to die peacefully in his sleep. They still tell his story in Dallas County, though the details shift with each generation's telling. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.